All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us. We do have our executive director here, Reverend Laura Everett of the Massachusetts Council of Churches. I'm glad to have her here, as well as the executive director of BMA 10 Point, Reverend David Wright, and Miss Jerunzi Harris of the Boston Black Church Vitality Project, who's working at Emmanuel Gospel Center. She's here with us. We run this before about 2 or 3 weeks ago, in particular, just trying to figure out the best way for particularly Black churches to re-enter. There's some nuances when it comes to some of the things that Black churches are doing. And so the one thing that we were trying to do is make sure that Black churches were safe. And the other piece to that is, if we look at the news, and we all are, in some sense, are seeing that for whatever reasons, minority groups are lower when it comes to vaccination rates. And so we did this together. And so we said, it's time for us to try it again, especially with this Delta variant. We don't quite, I'm speaking for everybody, but I will speak for myself. Don't quite understand why this seemed to be more infectious, seems to be deadly, and it seems to be taking kids out as well. This Delta variant seems to be very different than what we saw at the end of last summer going into the fall, as far as COVID is concerned. And so I reached out to Mr. Ronzi, and we reached out to Reverend Wright and said, let's try it again. So this is why we're here again. And we invited everybody because now, this is impacting everybody. We've seen the outbreak happen in Provincetown. And it seems from what I read, a lot of those folks were fully vaccinated. And so now we all are having to try to figure this out. And how do we do church? How do we have church? How do we continue on? What's the best way to do it? And so we have an expert here with us. I'm so excited to have her here. I wish it was a better way and another reason for her being here, but she's here and she's giving up her time, and we're excited about that. And we thank you for that, Dr. LaRocque. Dr. LaRocque is a doctor and associate professor of medicine of Harvard Medical School, associate director of MGH Center for Environment and Health. Like I said, she is always willing to help out and to hear our stories. And we are so excited to have her here with us. I just want to open up, and you can also drop anything in the chat at any time so we can see if you have questions. I just want to open them, just give us what is happening. And, is it a way for us to, I guess the biggest thing that we need to know is what's happening, and tell us about this Delta variant. Why is it seem to be so infectious?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with that. And if you have questions, just put them in the question and I'll try to answer them. So it's my pleasure to be with all of you. I've come to know some of you over the last year and a half, and I am, one thing I'm grateful for in the pandemic is the connections I've made to people I never would have met before, and I'm profoundly grateful for that. I'm an infectious disease doctor, and I'm also a scientist, and it's in that context that I know Adrian Gladden Young, who's also a fellow scientist, and that's how I met you, Reverend Young. So that's just some context. And I'm also a human being who's been living through this pandemic myself and struggling as well in many ways. I have 2 teenage boys, and it's, everybody's had lots of struggles. So, so that's me, just so you know where I'm coming from. So, what's going on right now? Maybe I'm just going to give you a little bit of my perspective. And, I'll freely admit that we are in uncharted territory in many ways, and you can get different opinions from different doctors and scientists, and you're seeing a lot of that in the kind of the press and in the public dialogue now. I do find that to be one of the components that is very consternating to me. As a country, we have really had a very difficult time kind of getting on the same page about what is actually happening, kind of agreeing at least to fall in line behind a public health plan and participate in it regardless of whether you agree with every element of it. I think we are a society that is founded on principles of individualism and a general lack of desire to be told what to do by the government. And that has characterized how we have responded to the pandemic. And I think it's been part of the reason why it's been so hard in our country to marshal some of the community-based public health response elements that are needed for this kind of virus, because we don't kind of have a shared perspective on what we need to do as communities to protect members of our own community through our actions. So that's why I find it enjoyable to talk to church groups, because I think you come from a sense of community and a sense of responsibility to individual members in the community. And I think that's a really important element of tackling the virus. So, what's going on right now? I'm very concerned and very frightened. I think we have known since this virus emerged that it has some very concerning elements of its biology. And frankly, those elements of its biology have continued to evolve since the virus emerged. So there's things that we just now know about it. And I think that I suspect everybody in this room also knows, the virus is transmitted through aerosol, which means that it's like cigarette smoke. So it spreads very easily, and particularly in poorly ventilated areas, but it's just, what it's like to be in a room with somebody who's smoking. This is how the virus is transmitted. It also can be transmitted from people who are asymptomatic. And that makes it very difficult because you don't know that you're sick and you can be transmitting the virus to other people. So that makes it very difficult to control. And so, the virus has also a very easy ability to mutate. And that is what has been going on over the entire course of the pandemic. We've seen various waves of different variants of the virus that have emerged. And we know that happens when the virus is under what we call selective pressure in a way, So, and unfortunately, people getting vaccinated is kind of a selective pressure too. And so there's a natural selection for viruses that are more infectious, that might evade some of our immune responses. All of that happens when there's a lot of virus circulating and it's not well controlled. So, the circumstances have been ripe, lots of virus around, lots of transmission happening, lots of replication for the virus to change its structure and sequence so that it can have some advantages. And that is what has emerged with the Delta variant, is that, kind of the part of it where it enters into the host cell has changed a little bit, and it has afforded the virus some real advantages. And to be honest with you, you could almost call this COVID-21, because this is a virus that is different in some of its characteristics from the ancestral strain that we dealt with before, namely how infectious it is to other people. And I really think that we're going to know in coming weeks that this may also be a virus that is more virulent also, so people get sicker with it. So that's kind of the context. I mean, of course, in the midst of all this, we've had this incredible advance, which is that we have vaccines. Incredible, like the safe, effective vaccines that have been developed in very careful, deliberate, science-based techniques, and that have turned out to work, even better than our wildest dreams. So we have been blessed with an extra tool in our toolkit. And so they are essential, like it is an essential piece of controlling COVID. But I think a message that maybe has been lost is that they are not like the way out of the pandemic. They are not alone some kind of exit strategy. And, I think in our excitement to try to encourage hesitant people to get vaccinated, or our excitement just to have this be over, we've lost track of the fact that we need all the tools in our toolbox in order to get this under control. And, I think that's the other piece of the story. And then, the other piece of the story is we have really a politically divided country, and people who have very strongly held beliefs that have been applied to this situation. And that's part of the problem that we're facing too, is our kind of societal response. And that only makes for more opportunities for the virus in many ways. So I think I gave you a very kind of broad arc of my thinking about it. So maybe I'll stop there and see if anybody wants to ask another question.
Yes, thank you, Dr. LaRocque. If you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat, or you can raise your hand. I just want to open up by asking, is it safe? I mean, some churches have already reopened. There's churches who never closed their doors for worship. But with this Delta variant, is it safe to open our doors back up for our worship services?
Yeah, I think that's the question that everybody, I think, is thinking about in all kinds of community gatherings and places where, groups of people are getting together. That is an appropriate question to be asking right now. And I think it's an appropriate question to ask right now because, things are changing very quickly right now. We are in the middle of a surge. And that means that the way we think about this right now is different than it was 8 weeks ago. And, the reality is things in Massachusetts are not as bad at all as they are in other parts of the country where they are absolutely horrific. Here in Massachusetts, we're seeing a steady uptick in cases. We're seeing a steady uptick in hospitalizations. We haven't seen a huge uptick in deaths, but that usually takes a little time to play out. So we're seeing concerning changes here in Massachusetts for sure. But of course, it's not the same as it is in Florida or Texas. But I do think that we are all connected, and that is one of the things that, is why it's very difficult. We can't wall ourselves off from what's going on in Florida or other states because people travel so much. We have initiated a lot of movement around the country, and so this is part of the reality of the world. So we're not that special here in Massachusetts. We are seeing concerning changes in our numbers. We are seeing that people are moving around the country. And we know that even in Massachusetts, different communities have different risks. And some places, the vaccination rates are high. Other places, there's pockets where they're lower. All of our young children are not vaccinated. So we are not walled off from what's going on. So I find myself very concerned here in Massachusetts too. And so the way I think about, a gathering is, well, first of all, what's the purpose of the gathering? And so that's why I feel like our conversations right now around our schools are incredibly vital, because we all recognize that certain gatherings are essential for our kids and for our communities. And so we really need to make school safe for kids, number one, I think. And then, church is also important. I'm not going to deny that for sure. So, one has to decide what are the benefits and what are the risks, and that you can do, I think, by taking a close look at the particular people in the group. So are they vaccinated? If everybody's vaccinated, I feel more comfortable. There are mitigation measures that have to be taken in addition to vaccination. Are those happening? Masking, ventilation, testing. So if we layer things on, the risk goes down. So, I think that we had a window of time a couple weeks ago when the rates had just plummeted. And that was a wonderful time when I think people wanted to gather again. And I think that unfortunately our country's leadership, in 2020 hindsight, I think it was a mistake to kind of tell people that, rip off your mask. It's the 4th of July. Let's all celebrate America is back. I think that in retrospect is part of why we are where we are today. So, these are kind of complicated messages to get across to people that, this is not just a ticket out, if you know what I mean. So the question about a gathering, I mean, in this moment, I feel very careful about being around other people. And when you do it, you want it to be in a thoughtful way, and also very cognitive of what the risks are to the people in the group, So I think these are decisions that people are having to make right now in a very rapidly changing landscape also.
Thank you. And we do, Reverend Laura put this in the post. I just want to make sure that I echo it, as well as with Mr. Runzi Harris and Reverend Wright. She dropped in the post, church leaders also hear us affirm your faithful work in making plans, revising plans, trying to be safe and wise. Here our admiration for you too. We see your work and know God sees it too. We are all doing the best that we can. And that is very, very true. I believe that wholeheartedly for everyone who's here tonight. There's a few questions in the chat. Dr. LaRocque, if you want to go ahead and answer those questions that's in the chat right now.
Okay, I'm gonna see if I can read them from my
Okay,
glasses.
I can read them for you if you want.
I've heard that in other countries, England specifically, the Delta variant has wreaked havoc, but then once levels start dropping, the rates of infection have dropped off very quickly. The person who told me this was hopeful that it's just a question of waiting it out for another couple of weeks and then things will improve quickly. Is this true? Well, I mean, I think that I would say that's a fair characterization of any epidemic, which is that it goes up and then something changes and it can go down very quickly. We've already seen that in our own lived experience of the pandemic before. And there's a lot of things that happen, right? So as an infection is surging, people start changing their behavior. And frankly, that's probably the most important thing. I don't know if our political leaders have the will anymore to, mandate public health interventions. We're seeing that kind of play out now in our political life. Many governors just don't want to do this anymore. And I think they're wrong. The data that I see shows that they're wrong, because the public does best when there is a clear, consistent message and recommendation that everybody adheres to. And frankly, if you just go by the numbers that the CDC is saying now, we have substantial to high transmission in Massachusetts. So we should be indoor masking across the board in the state, but we are not. So on the other hand, people are not dumb, and we've lived through this. So behavior starts to change too. So once things peak, then they can very, very quickly fall off. And I mean, that's, I think, the truth about all of this, which is that we ultimately have control over what happens with this now as a society. And we can either exert that control through our collective government-led efforts, or we can individually and through our local organizations also choose to change our behavior. I mean, where we are right now with the surge is vaccination is very important. And I do want to talk about vaccination too, but vaccination is not a response to a surge, because for the vaccines that we have now, you need, for the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, you need 2 doses spaced out by 3 to 4 weeks. And then you don't really have your immune response ready to go until about 2 weeks after the second dose. So it takes 6 weeks in order for the effect of additional vaccination to come into play. So when there's a dynamic situation like we have now, that's when you really have to pull out your other tools from the toolbox. And so I think that my answer is that yes, things can drop off, but it really just depends on how we respond. And I do also want to say that we knew this was coming. I mean, this Delta variant, we watched what happened in India. We knew it was there. We know that we are connected to the rest of the world. Like, you can just watch the march of this across the world. Every country now has decided to just replicate what they've seen in other countries. You know, it's been hard to stop these waves. But yes, this wave was coming, and this wave did wash over other countries. And, you know, I think we have to learn from what's happened in other countries too. And, you know, one place that we have to learn from, I think, is Israel, where they have achieved very high levels of vaccine coverage, you know, much higher than we have the capacity within our society to achieve. And yet they are also experiencing a Delta wave right now. So that just speaks to the biology of this virus. And I just want to say, you know, I think the CDC in their leaked slide set, which you all may have seen, you know, pointed out that you know, this viral variant is as infectious as chickenpox. And so that is another thing to just have in your head. I mean, people who are my age, and you know, we had chickenpox when we were kids. Not everybody now knows about chickenpox, but you know, you understand that chickenpox is really contagious. You know, chickenpox parties, you know, where your parents wanted you to get chickenpox. All you had to do was show up in the house of the kid with chickenpox, and everybody had it. So this is a very difficult virus to prevent transmission if somebody shows up in the space with it. And so, I mean, that's the other element that I think is important when you think about your, you know, your church setting. And I think this has been true all along, is that, you know, it doesn't matter what you're doing to protect your community. If there's no virus entering into your community, you could wear, you know, you could say, I'm going to wear purple hats and it doesn't, you know, but when that one person who has the virus shows up, and if you don't have the components of protection in that gathering, then you're in trouble. And so I think that's kind of why remembering that we have other tools in our toolkit that we need to keep using. And I did want to say a word about vaccination, which is that vaccination is really important. I've done a lot of personal efforts, you know, as have so many people in the whole state, you know, trying to get people vaccinated, talking to people, giving vaccines, bringing vaccines out into the community, because it really matters. It is very important for people to be vaccinated. Okay, do you want me to keep working down?
Yeah,
or does
so I think you
anybody
answered Sarah's question. It is a solid blanket recommendation that all indoor gatherings be masked. And from what I heard, you're definitely saying yes.
Well, I think that this is kind of where we have this issue, which I find it quite difficult. You know, here we are so far into this that we have the same concern we had early on, which is that we have, well, at this point, we have a CDC, which is issuing very, you know, sensible data-based guidelines that this is our public health system in the United States. Okay, so that's how it works. That guidance comes from the federal government, and then down it trickles down to your state and local public health officials to use that guidance. And as we are seeing play out in this country, some ignore it, others adopt it, but it's not uniformly applied. And it is all, frankly, being determined by political leaders for the most part. So right now, the CDC guidance is pretty clear that if you are in an area of substantial or high transmission, which most of Massachusetts is in at this point, that indoor masking is appropriate. And I will say that's what our hospitals are doing. I think the hospitals in Massachusetts have been really good at being sure we don't have transmission within our facilities, and now we're highly vaccinated, and yet we are all masking all the time indoors. And so now, whether that happens in your community or not is at the discretion of your local Board of Health. But the guidance from the CDC is pretty clear. So
Gail Miller asks, what about congregational singing and speaking in unison?
So, I mean, I think that's one of the things that we've learned from how the virus works, that it's, an aerosolized virus. So singing and, things that help your kind of vocal cords aerosolize are a concern. And so I think that, again, this all has to be contextualized within what I said before, which is we're having we're in the midst of a surge right now. And you have to look at a given community and kind of think very cautiously about what the risks are for that given community and how you're going to try to mitigate that for that group. And I think different people can, defensively make different choices about that. I will say that, one of the ways I am approaching the fact that we have this circumstance now is I ask myself, what are the values that I am applying to the information we are learning now? And, my value is, number one, I am a cautious person. I believe in the precautionary principle. So I don't want to do something that might have a catastrophic impact that I regret later until I feel really confident about it. So that's one thing. I use the precautionary principle. The second thing is I really value human life. And I think you guys probably do too. And so you have to think about, like, what kind of risks are you willing to take that might threaten human life? That's important. So I think, it's probably appropriate to be upfront. Like, what are the values that you're applying to the decision-making in this moment? And to me, that leads you to a decision that is, it leads me to certain decisions. It may not lead other people to those decisions, but those are the values that I apply in the settings that we have now. And I just want to say a word about the Provincetown outbreak and the vaccination, the cases in vaccinated people. So, I mean, that's the element that I mentioned, which is that this is a different virus. I like this idea of calling it COVID-21. And that's because we learned a lot from that Provincetown outbreak. We learned some really important things. And I actually was in Provincetown in early July, and I think I have a sense of why things happened the way they did. But it's important to remember that vaccines they're not like shields of invisibility. They're not like bug zappers. They don't like protect you like you have some kind of force field around you. A vaccine helps your body see part of a pathogen, a bacteria, virus, whatever, so that it develops a bit of an immune response to it, so that the next time you see it, you're better prepared. But vaccines are never 100%. Like that was never going to be the case for these vaccines. There was always going to be some people who would get infected no matter what. And so that's just something to know. But the other thing that's pretty clear and that we learned from the Provincetown outbreak is that people who are vaccinated definitely can have lots of virus in their nasopharynx, a lot, as much as an unvaccinated person has. And we have to assume that they can spread that to other people. I think that the way that Provincetown outbreak played out is pretty clear evidence of that, because it was explosive. 1,000 people infected in a short time. Of course, there was a lot of mingling behavior. There wasn't a lot of masks. You know, the other things weren't happening, but a lot of vaccinated people became, you know, ill with some symptoms and had lots of virus in their nasopharynx. And then I'm sure we're going to find when we sequence the virus that they spread it to other people. So the good news is the vaccines did their job. You know, not that many people got hospitalized, nobody's died, but it was kind of a game changer in our understanding about the role of vaccines in interrupting transmission. So what it does tell us is that we were being a little bit overly optimistic about the fact that these vaccines were going to interrupt the cycle of transmission of COVID. It would appear that that was too optimistic based on this outbreak, because a lot of vaccinated people had virus that was being shed. And I think that that's part of what we're seeing now. I think we've all experienced people we know who've been vaccinated, who've tested positive or had mild symptoms. And that's good, because that's the vaccine doing its job of preventing severe illness. But that means that the vaccine alone is really not going to work for tamping down transmission. It's going to do a very important job of keeping people from getting super sick. But it just reminds us that we have to use our other tools as well, especially as we see a surge like this going on.
Thank you. I think people, you can answer this because I see a few people having this, as far as the singing, congregational singing and speaking. Is it safe, especially indoors? Should we do it? Should we not do it?
I mean, if I were somebody who decided that you want to proceed to have a church gathering, and then the way I would think about it would be, number one, I'd want everybody in the church to be vaccinated, like 100%. That would be an expectation. I would want everybody in the building to be wearing a mask. And I mean, those would be the things that would make me feel more comfortable. I'd like to have as few people there as necessary. And then, boy, if you really wanted to be safe, you could have everybody take a test before they come to the church. I mean, so that would be like 3 layers of really great protection. And, you know, then you've got a group of people gathering together in circumstances where it's pretty unlikely that somebody's going to slip in and transmit it to other people. So I would focus less on the nature of the behavior within the church and focus more on having some of the mitigation strategies in place.
Okay. And I think that answers a lot of our questions, at least from what I'm seeing going through the chat. But I do want to get your answer on this. Nancy Dodge said, our church has been safely meeting since September, but when the mandates were lifted, we stopped disinfecting everything after everyone left. Should we go back to doing that? Should we tape off pews again? We want to keep everyone safe.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, I feel like this this kind of disinfecting protocols is really just a holdover from the early days when we didn't know very well how the virus was transmitted. And if you read the CDC website, and by the way, I do want to refer everybody to the CDC website. It is your best and most reliable source of information. They've stated very clearly that the heavy disinfecting is really not an important piece of things. So let me just go back to say that it's a virus that is transmitted through aerosols in the air. So it's breathing the same air that somebody who's infected is breathing. That's how it's transmitted. Now, rarely somebody might cough onto a surface, and maybe if there's a lot of virus, there's some potential that you could transmit it to another person that way, but that is not the main mode of transmission. So I think it's not that useful to focus on this disinfecting and cleaning. It's a good policy to have, you know, things cleaned, but it's not the way to prevent transmission of COVID. The way to prevent transmission of COVID is ventilation. So you need ventilation. So the important thing, just again, imagine that it's cigarette smoke. You want to open the windows. You want to have a lot of air exchanges if you have an air handling system, and you might have filters too. So it's just, we know now how this virus is transmitted. Unfortunately, it's transmitted in the most absolutely contagious and difficult way of any virus, but it is not really transmitted by touching surfaces. So I would focus your efforts on the mitigation strategies that work for this virus, which is ventilation. And it kind of relates the same thing with distancing. I mean, distancing is really important for, you know, if I cough and I cough out a droplet, which is, you know, just like a little bit of spit. You can think of it that way. You know, when you see somebody cough, that has some weight to it and it lands. So when somebody's 6 feet away, the goal there is that if I cough some spit, it's not going to land on them. But this virus is not really transmitted just like that. It's mostly transmitted by aerosols or smoke-like. So you know that even if somebody's 6 feet away from you, you can still smell the smoke when they exhale it. So again, the solution for that is you want good ventilation. You want the breeze coming through, you want to disperse the viral particles. And that's why having events outdoors is really a good way to be sure that things are well ventilated. I mean, we definitely know that the risk of transmitting COVID outdoors is much, much lower than indoors.
Okay, and I think this I'm going to follow up to that. Reverend Liz Weber says this. You talked about distancing. If we're wearing masks indoors and not singing, how much does distancing also matters? And what about outdoors? You just talked about being outdoors. Do we still need to wear a mask outdoors and distance?
You know, I don't worry much about outdoors. I mean, I'm going to tell you in my personal, people who are spread out a reasonable distance and outside, I think you can't worry about wearing masks. You know, like it's one thing if you're if it's a football team tackling people, but you know, people who are standing reasonably not on top of each other and outside, you know, I don't worry about transmission in those scenarios. I'm not going to tell you that it can't happen, but it's pretty unusual. So I think that outside is well ventilated, and masking doesn't add much to the amount of ventilation you achieve by being outside. Now, if you're inside and singing, I don't know, I guess I don't have a pat answer for you about singing. Like singing is part of church, and it would be very hard to think about, like, if you're going to proceed to have a church gathering, then you're assuming that you're going to engage in the behaviors that constitute church, and one of those is singing. We do know that there's very well documented outbreaks that have been associated with singing in church. So I think that would be the reasons why you want to be sure you're putting all the layers of protection in for your group of community members who join you in church, you know. I'm not sure I would tell you not to sing, I guess is what I'm getting at, but I would tell you to be sure you have these other measures in place.
If you're going to sing.
If you're going to sing.
Yeah. Okay. So Ian asks, can you comment on the safety of children under 12 gathering together for childcare, Sunday school for an hour during a church service? That's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, kids are really the issue of the day right now because they are not vaccinated. And I think there's been a little bit of mythology that's sprung up about kids kind of somehow being specially protected from COVID. And, you know, it's not really the case. Children get COVID. They can spread COVID. You know, compared to older people, they do not as often get sick, but sometimes they get very sick. And they also have this inflammatory syndrome that can develop weeks after infection that can be quite severe. I mean, COVID is not like the flu. It is a different virus. It is a multi-system infection. And on the whole, I would rather not have kids be getting COVID. So that's just the truth. So yeah, children gathering together is a concern. Like, I think those are the kinds of things that's why we have to have very careful layers of protection in our schools. And it's no different in a church setting if you have kids gathering.
Yes, and I've heard from other churches who are saying that there's some parents who don't feel safe with 12 and under because they're not able to get vaccinated to bring their kids to a children's church or anything like that. So it sounds like you're going down that same route. It's just, it may not be safe at this time because they can't get vaccinated.
Well, I mean, I think that I'll just go back to kind of the societal view on this, which is that I feel like we somehow made a choice as a society, whether it's purposeful or not, that we accept that children get COVID. And we, like, at least in some states in our country, we seem to have just accepted that. I don't know that we have to accept that, but, if you don't take steps to protect them, then they will get it. And, the consequences thereof will happen after that. So I'm of the perspective that we should try to prevent our kids from getting COVID. And there are vaccines coming for younger kids. Today that FDA just approved the Pfizer vaccine, which is wonderful news for 16 and up. And I think that probably soon enough, it will be officially approved for 12 and up also. And I understand that the regulatory submission for 2 and up is going to be coming in, the next couple of weeks. So it's coming. It's coming. It's kind of a matter of, can you hold out? I mean, because right now, if people are getting sick with the Delta variant right now, and that's a different virus to some degree than the one that we had in the last surge. And there are early signals that more kids are getting severely sick with this strain of the virus. And, this is one of the, excuse me, this is one of the dynamic elements of an epidemic, which is that it takes a little bit of time for us to have a solid understanding. I mean, I wish we had better data systems in place, even after the first, in the US, than we have more than we had before, but we don't have a perfect system. But I do know from, what I see going on in the South and what I hear from colleagues there, that they see a lot more very sick kids than they saw in the previous waves. And frankly, that kind of reconnaissance from people on the ground is not to be dismissed. It takes time for the data to filter through and to be synthesized and put out there. But I take that kind of information very seriously. I think back on when we first had COVID, and everybody said, well, pregnant women, really, it's no different for them than anybody else. But that really was a very bald statement to make because we just didn't know yet. And now in retrospect, we do know that pregnant women get more sick with COVID. So I just think we have to be a little bit humble about this virus. And I think we have to take heed of what is being reported in places where there's a lot of Delta being infecting people. And there are reports that it is a more concerning syndrome in kids than we've seen before. Okay. So the way to protect kids is to get transmission as low as possible so that they're not contracting it. And that involves, vaccinating all around them, as many people as you can, and applying the other mitigation measures to the greatest degree possible so that the kids don't all have to get it. But if it's out there, they will get it.
And so you're saying that, you want to be careful even with small groups and Sunday school and things of that nature, even when you're mixing ages, especially those kids that are under 12 that can't be vaccinated yet. They're going to children's church for that hour, and then they're going to their parents. They could possibly spread it because they're not vaccinated. They could spread it to their parents. They could spread it to older person that's there in the congregation, even though they're vaccinated.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, again, it's a matter of applying your values to this situation. Right now, lots of things are changing in Massachusetts. Kids are about to start school. There's going to be a lot more mixing. So those kinds of circumstances pose a different risk as time goes on.
Okay.
I think people have made choices to resume gatherings with other mitigation strategies for kids, like masks and ventilation. And, we were okay over the earlier part of the summer. There wasn't that much COVID around. But the issue now is that there's more and more COVID around. And so those same settings, which, in July, if you didn't have anybody coming into the group with COVID, then everybody was fine. But now there's more COVID out there. And so there's a higher chance of it being introduced into those kinds of circumstances, and the risk is different.
Okay. And so this question I think is very important because I think we're all trying to figure this out. Steve Watson asked the question, I think many of our churches, if we open our doors, can't necessarily get 100% vaccinated congregations on any given Sunday. He asked, are there any congregations requiring vaccination from attendees or for attendees? Is that something that you kind of talked about it a little bit, but is that something you think, if you're a pastor, that's something we should have, saying like people who are coming in, who are participating in the worship service, speaking or singing, they need to be vaccinated and we need to see the card?
So that is an ethical and societal question. And I think your church leaders should, I would welcome church leaders taking a position on this, because I appreciate that the Massachusetts Teachers Association has taken a position that they support mandatory vaccination for teachers. And so I put that to you that maybe you all should discuss that, because that's the question. I think that part of how we are going to protect our communities is by getting as many people vaccinated, as we can. And there's the carrot and the stick. And I know, churches have been very important places, sites of vaccination, sites for education about vaccination. I don't like having to force somebody to do something either, but I do also think that, groups you're allowed to set boundaries of behavior that you expect for a group. And especially when one person's choices affects other people. We do this in all kinds of settings in our society. We require you to wear a seatbelt when you drive a car. So it's not unheard of. We require children to have the measles vaccine when they go to school. Like that, it's very analogous at this point. So I would say that certain settings, one should be allowed to set expectations about what individuals do in order to gain access to those settings. So yeah, from my opinion, I would say if I were a church pastor, I would like to know why 100% of my church members weren't vaccinated. Like, what are the concerns? Do they need to know more? Do they need help getting to a site? What are the reasons? And, try to understand that. And
now, Dr. LaRocque, you opening up Pandora's box, because I'm sure that pastors on here can say there's several reasons their members, partners, or parishioners are not vaccinated. I know I can. And I just know that some of them just, we all have a choice that we have to make. Some people just won't. So we have to do our job to try to do the best that we can to keep everyone safe, which is to my wife's question, which masks do you recommend? Are some that are accessible better than others? because we all know that, you said that we need to wear a mask. We're going indoors, we're going to be around people because of this surge that we're facing. We need to wear a mask. Are there any that are better as far as protection than others?
Let me just give you the simple kind of conceptualizations about masks. So there's two types of masks. Basically there's masks that have the purpose of preventing you from spreading the virus or any aerosols to other people, right? So most masks, cloth masks or surgical masks, the aim of that mask is to prevent an infected person from aerosolizing and spreading the virus. So the mask is not protecting the wearer, the mask is protecting other people. And so that's why universal masking is really what has to be done. That's why universal masking makes sense, because if everybody's wearing a mask, if somebody comes into the place and is asymptomatically spreading the virus, they've got a mask on. So if universal masking of that type is happening, that protects the community. So that's what most masks that are, that's the reason behind universal masking. And that's why a cloth mask or a surgical mask makes sense for that purpose. It's not 100%, but it's very good. And we know it works. And we know it's been very good at decreasing transmission of the virus. If everybody's wearing a mask, then there's less people coming into a group that could unwittingly spread it to other people. Now, there's other types of masks that protect the wearer. And these are, N95 masks that we wear in the hospital. So when I go in to see a patient who has COVID, I wear full gear and an N95 mask, which is a very tightly fitted mask that does not allow small particles to pass through it. That is not a feasible mask for people to wear kind of around over the course of the day for very long. It's uncomfortable, it's a little hard to breathe. And then there's also now these KN95 masks, which are similarly protective to some degree to the wearer. They're tightly fitted and they filter particulates. So, universal masking has the goal of having everybody in a situation where if you are infected and spreading the virus, the chance is less that you're going to do that because everybody's wearing a mask. That's what we're aiming for with universal masking. Now, separately, some people like to wear these more high-grade N95 masks to protect themselves. And, that's not unreasonable. Honestly, I will tell you now, I feel very uncomfortable going into certain settings where there's a lot of unmasked people. And when I do that, I wear an N95 now because I don't want to breathe in the air that those people are breathing out. So again, it's the type of mask and for what purpose the mask is being worn. And there's a little bit of a mix of the two, in the sense that, there is some protection for the wearer in wearing a surgical mask. We've seen that, but the main protection is for the other people.
Okay.
Did I explain that clearly?
Yes, you did. I think you answered. I know, you answered the question for me. There's a few other questions I want to try to get to before our hour is up. Robin Bartlett says, how do you feel about plexiglass in church pandemic theater?
Yeah, I think that the plexiglass situation has really turned out to be not useful. And there was an early desire, again, before we really knew that this was like cigarette smoke, an aerosol virus, when it was more that you might be projecting small droplets to other people. There was the sense that maybe the plexiglass would be a good strategy because it would, stop these droplets, spittle, right. I guess, it would stop it from hitting somebody else. Well, first of all, that's not really the way the virus is spread. It's like cigarette smoke, which goes very happily around plexiglass. And then the other thing with the plexiglass is it turns out that it probably just interferes with the general flow of air. And you end up with kind of pockets of stagnant air. So I think that plexiglass has not proven itself to be a useful mitigation strategy. So I don't see a clear role for that in any kind of setting.
Okay.
it's a holdover, just like the intense disinfection from the early days of understanding about how this was transmitted.
Okay. Thank you. Maple Street Church said most of our churches, and this is true, I was definitely going to ask you about this. Most of our churches don't have ventilation systems. Besides opening the window, what are we to do? Are air purifiers the way to go?
Yeah, I mean, that's the reality here in Massachusetts in the summer. We don't have air handling systems. I will say opening the windows is pretty good. Like it makes a big difference. So opening windows and doors, getting across breeze, like that matters. Like I wouldn't negate the importance of using the common sense strategies for ventilation that there are. I don't know a lot about air purification and air filters, but I do know it would make a lot of sense that would add something to the ventilation strategy. I don't know how, I'm afraid I just don't know enough about the topic of how that actually works in a large space, but I certainly find it to be a very reasonable additional mitigation measure. So I think if you have an air handling system, it's a lot easier to imagine how you do filtration, because that's part of an air handling system, is that you have a filter. So these kind of portable air filters, I know less about.
Okay.
Again, I'm just admitting my own lack of knowledge about that.
Yeah, I know. I think that's true to a lot of churches who, I mean, our church is historic church and the airflow is not the best. And so I think we're going to be in some trouble when it comes to wintertime, when it's actually cold and it's not feasible for us to open up the door, open up windows. And that's something I think all leaders are going to have to figure that one out as far as the airflow.
That is a real challenge that we have here. And let us not forget what it was like last winter. I mean, we have to be humble here. I think things are different. We have vaccines, we have, we have different tools, but if we look at the curves of what's going on and we compare to where we were a year ago, where I believe we had the same situation where warm climates in August were having a steep curve of cases, and then New England, it was the winter. So I just look back and it makes me trepidatious about our own winter.
I think you answered this question about is it unwise for us as pastors and worship leaders to lead service without no mask, even though people are saying we're far away? It sounds like from what you're saying, that's your value system. You want to make sure people are vaccinated and do as much as you can to mitigate transmission.
Yep.
And so that's a value system. That's something that the leaders are going to have to say, we want to see your vaccination card if you're going to be singing.
Let me just make clear
okay,
that that's not a free ticket, because we know that vaccinated people who get infected can still shed the virus in high amounts.
Wow.
So like you have to, I think, reposition what we think about the role of the vaccine. The role of the vaccine is in preventing death and hospitalization. That's always what we knew about the role of the vaccine, was preventing death and hospitalization. It is proving still, even in the face of the Delta variant, to be pretty good at preventing death and hospitalization. But it does not appear to be that good at preventing getting the virus and shedding it. So I think that it's not a tool for preventing outbreaks. And so, especially if you are in a community of people where some people are not vaccinated for whatever reason, like that's a special responsibility to those people, because just because I'm vaccinated, I could still give it to them. That's what we're learning. That's where the messaging on the vaccine got a little derailed.
Thank you for clearing it up. And I think that is very good, because a lot of us may be going by the messaging, you get vaccinated, you're good. And almost like you said, it's a force field that nothing can get to you. But I thank you for telling us that we still are able to spread it, even though we are vaccinated. It sounds like you're saying that even if, so the way our most churches are set up with worship leaders and pastors, they mostly share the same stage. And if it's like smoke, if someone's singing, someone's preaching, those, the aerosol can still be in the air. So it sounds like to me what you're saying is that even though we may be vaccinated, we still can spread it, not only to praise and worship leaders, to pastors. Once we get done singing and preaching, it could spread to other members of the congregation.
I think you just have to recognize that you want your congregation to be vaccinated because you don't want people to get hospitalized or die with COVID. But the reality is that people who are vaccinated are not, the people who are vaccinated can still get and shed the virus and spread it to other people. Okay. So if you're trying to protect vulnerable people in your community, people who are vulnerable because they haven't gotten the vaccine themselves, or because maybe their immune system is not so good and they didn't have a good response to the vaccine. If you have people like that in your community, it's insufficient for you to be vaccinated to protect them. You need to do more also. So we got our messaging off, I would say, back a few months ago when we said to everybody, you're vaccinated, take off your masks. Yeah. Okay, I think that in retrospect, that was not a good message, especially in light of the Delta variant. And we've seen that really has come back to haunt us a little bit. I mean, I think we were all desperately wanting to move on, but that was a little oversimplistic a message. So I think, again, applying values to this decision, which is that I want to have an in-person gathering and I want to allow people to come into that space who might be unvaccinated or who might be at special risk. I want to take steps to protect them. And unfortunately, just being vaccinated is not sufficient.
Okay. So, and second, the question to Robin, I want to make sure we answer this fully. She says, even though they're at a distance, is it safe for her to take her mask off and preach? Let's say they're 20 feet away. Is it safe for her or any of us to take off the mask and preach? And, I know our voice does something that's special when we are projecting and singing and preaching. Is that safe, or should we say, nobody should be in the congregation while we're preaching and singing, if we're going to do that? And it's almost altering the whole service, right? So, I mean, these are a lot of, we're struggling with this as leaders of trying to make sure people are able to come in and have a safe service, but we don't want anyone to get sick.
So I'll just come back to what I said before, which it's a value judgment. Yeah. It's a value judgment, because I can't tell you what's safe. I mean, I can tell you what, how would your community feel if that ended up being the circumstance where a preacher was the one who was responsible for that circumstance? Would that be a scenario that you just wouldn't want to have happen? Or is that something you could tolerate? Like, that's kind of the question of the day, because we're in a different moment now where the rates are going up, things are changing. I'm not kind of putting out there that this is the way the world is going to be forever. I hope not. But, in this moment when things are changing, when rates are going up, and you just want to be more careful. And we know that people who themselves have been vaccinated can still transmit the virus to other people. Apply your values to all of that information. Okay. I think that's the way I would approach it.
So two more questions. I know that there's a lot of questions in the chat, and we want to make sure we keep our commitment to Dr. LaRocque, and we thank you for spending this time with us. Ronald Jones asked the question, will the Delta variant mutate into another even stronger viral strand, or is this the only new strand that we need to be concerned about?
Well, I mean, that's that's the $1,000,000 question for those of us who are in, the science of this situation. It's the concern that, that this is why it's very important to get transmission of the virus driven down as low as possible. That's why it matters for everybody's health that we stop the huge amount of viral circulation that's going on around the world and that's happening in our own country, because that poses a risk. That is making the exact scenario where the virus is making copies of itself a lot, all the time. Every time it infects a person and moves on to another person, and all that transmission gives the virus opportunities to make a mistake in its genetic code. And if one of those mistakes happens to offer it benefit, evolutionary benefit, then yes, more variants will emerge. That is what has happened throughout the pandemic. We've already seen that. So that is why, I mean, if we could, we need to stop this. We just need to stop it. We need to get this stopped, because that is the risk of not stopping it. Now, do I know if that's going to happen? I don't know. Am I worried that that could happen? Yes. Yeah, so we don't know what the future holds, but the best thing for everybody is to stop COVID. It may be that we have, a world that's not capable of that. We may have a world that's not capable of that, but we also have a virus that may take advantage of that circumstance. And it already has, because of what we're seeing now with this variant. That is the same process in play. We have a more infectious virus now than we had last year.
Which is why you call it COVID-21, right? So the last question, and I know I have an older grandmother who's in her 80s, and they're very faithful to the church. And I had to tell my grandmother, I was like, listen, don't go to church. I just don't think it's safe right now. I'm not sure what kind of steps they're taking. And older members who are going to church, they're going to do communion. And we have a lot of different traditions who are represented on this call tonight. I happen to be Baptist, and we give out individual cups with the wafer on top. There's other traditions where they may do, coming up to the either pastor or priest or, the person who leading the service or the church, and getting it from that person and partaking of a cup or a chalice. Is it safe to do communion or the Holy Eucharist? And then, how do we do that in a safe manner? Because that's a huge part of what it means to be a Christian.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we've been living with this for 18 months. I'm not contending that we just can't, as a society, not live and do the many things that we have to do to be part of the world. It's not tenable anymore to tell people not to do X, Y, or Z. But I think what is important is to understand the way the risk happens, to take a real close look at your own community and what levels of infection are going on, to understand who is in your community who might be at special risk, and to do our best to advocate for our country, to get this under control in other regions where we're all paying the price for what's going on to some degree. So I'm not really answering your question. I think I'm just saying that you have to apply some values to the decision. Unmasking briefly is not as big a thing as never wearing a mask through the whole time and singing at the top of your voice. If I were leading a group, I would think first about who in my community am I most concerned about. who do I want to protect from severe illness? And it would be people who are older and people who have medical problems and people who can't be vaccinated. And I would ask myself, am I taking all the steps available to me to protect those people because they matter to me? And I would work backwards from that. And I would start by saying the first thing that I want to do to protect all those people is to be sure they've been vaccinated. And then I would work backwards from that and say, what are the other strategies that we need to apply to our setting? And if it doesn't feel right for the group, then I think it's totally defensible at this point to say we can't do it in a way that feels that is aligned with our values. But it needs to align with your values, I think. And I wish we had a more coherent, public health strategy that we were all abiding by, but I just don't think we quite have that.
Well, thank you, Dr. LaRocque, so much for your time and answer these questions. I didn't want it to be something that you was given as far as a presentation. It sounds like people had a lot of questions. I don't think we answered all of them. I feel like there's, a lot of other questions that pastors are trying to get through and wrestle with, as far as, reentry, trying to get church back to its traditional sense. Seems to be very hard. From what you said to us, there's a lot of things that we need to go back and pray about, also think about and try to figure out some type of strategy and system to doing that. We have Mr. Ronzi Harris. I think she's still here. Just wondering if she had any closing words that she would like to say. And then after that, I'm going to ask if Reverend Laura would have any words. Geronzi, do you have anything you'd like to say?
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. LaRocque. And I really appreciated, the continued encouragement of applying our values to the information that we're receiving. And so as church leaders who have the responsibility to preserve and to educate, I would say, can you speak a bit to, or I don't know if this is a closing remark, but I guess I'm asking Dr. LaRocque to just give us a closing remark about, what are those values that we're sharing with our congregations on Sunday morning when we're preaching, not just because, we have to mitigate the virus in our buildings and in our gatherings, but because, this is one of the most relevant issues of our day. And it's our responsibility to address it as Christians.
I appreciate that you're asking me for thoughts on that, because I think I should be asking all of you about that. But I just want to say that my feeling is that I heard this actually from a friend of mine, Reverend Vernon Walker, who is in Boston. And I when he said it, I thought, man, this is exactly right, which is that the predictor of how a society, a community gets through a crisis is social cohesion and having community. And so, honestly, I think that you guys are the people who know best about how to build that. And that's what gets people through a crisis. And so I can give you some data, and then I encourage you to apply your knowledge of what it means to be in community with people to think about how to use that information.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ronzi Harris. Reverend Laura, you have the final words, and do you mind closing us with a word of prayer?
Absolutely. I'll never forget visiting. Oh, sorry. I was pulling up the YouTube channel, and all of the audio from came up as well. Anyway, I'll never forget visiting a church where the pastor began and to say the church's mission statement, and the rest of the congregation followed along and repeated the values of the congregation with them. At Mass Council, for a while now, we've been saying that our values are delight, excellence, diversity, relationship, and gratitude. And so to be able to say together that we want to delight in one another and delight in God and make our decisions starting in that. I do not think we can delight if people are getting sick, and to start in a place of values. Dr. LaRocque, thank you for reminding us. It is incredibly hard, church leaders, what you are doing. Please hear our profound gratitude for the incredibly hard work of making plans, revising plans, adapting and readapting. You have adapted so many times. It is wearying and tiring. Ken and I have done it too. We know how hard it is to change and change and change again. And how hard it is to constantly be the one going into every church meeting saying, no, I don't think we can do that. No, that's probably unsafe. No, that might get Mother Tosh sick, or no, that might get Deacon Barnes ill. You know, that nobody wants to be the killjoy. But this is what we do to preserve community at times, and that is for the greater good that we are called for, that sense of the one body of Christ, and that the adaptation, the flexibility, the creativity that you are showing is not only seen by us, but seen by God. I'm trusting that though so much is changing, we serve a changeless God. That our faithfulness will be rewarded some way, somehow, and that there is a counter witness that you are offering. We want to do it's pretty clear that we're moving into something that we need more community and more resources for. I'm going to put up a poll quickly that asks, how is your church going to gather this Sunday? If you could answer that poll, we'll share the results. Are you gathering just online? Are you gathering in person only and outdoors? Are you in person and indoors? Are you only online? We're just curious about what that looks like. We know that this is a self-selected audience. And then one of the other things I'm curious about is, it sounds like there might be a willingness also to hear a conversation. We've got some other experts, in person, outdoors, and online. Robin, thank you, Pastor Robin. Sorry, didn't have all of our options available. So we're seeing a number of options, and still a number of people that are online only. So that you all can get a sense of what your peers and colleagues are doing. And maybe we need to, would it be helpful for us to more regularly show this across the Commonwealth so that you could see what other colleagues are doing? Sometimes it's hard to see. Yep. Okay. I'm going to give this just another moment. And then I'm going to offer one other poll, because we had a hunch about another need in the community. And then I'm going to publish the results. Okay. We'll share the results. So in person, online, I clearly missed the class on how to write polling questions. You're getting your polling data from an English major. We're going to do one more quick poll from Pastor Laura's non-scientific polling venue. Okay. One more poll. Which is around vaccine hesitancy. And we know that vaccine hesitancy comes from multiple different sources and for many different reasons. Reverend Kenneth and I are working on some grant funding. Would you be interested in a workshop on how to speak with folks who are vaccine hesitant? We know we've got some colleagues in the Department of Public Health for whom this is, there's some tools and techniques. Those of you who are evangelists by training, maybe you feel comfortable in talking to folks who are vaccine hesitant, so you don't need this. Or maybe you've looked at the data. You all know that the data weekly is posted and disaggregated, don't have a ton of vaccine hesitancy. Anti-vaxxers, mostly everybody's vaccinated, right? Like communities vary, and the reasons for vaccine hesitancy are really different. But what we know is the attentive listening, which frankly, pastors, you have some of the best skills for. What Ken and I have learned, Pastor Kenneth and I have learned, is that some of the pastoral listening is really some of what we know how to do almost intuitively. Okay, I'm going to end this poll so you can see. It seems like there's some interest. So we'll go back to our drawing boards and figure out who of our colleagues might be willing to offer a workshop for us around vaccine, intro to conversations around vaccine hesitancy. We're now at the 200 level of classes we never got taught in seminary, amen? Okay. Thank you. All right. And finally, my deep and profound gratitude for our colleagues at the Boston Black Church Vitality Project and the Black Ministerial Association and 10-Point Coalition of Greater Boston. We began this work knowing that Black churches, churches of color, immigrant churches were bearing disproportionate burden, were more exposed in a storm, and that is a wounding to the whole of the body of Christ. That is a wounding that is unjust, that continues on, that there's much work that needs to be done for. That is a continuing injustice within the body. And there are profound opportunities to learn together, to heal together, to make right what has been wrong, and to listen and to learn the ways that God is healing and moving. And so I am profoundly grateful to learn with colleagues who have modeled a kind of resiliency that candidly white churches have not had to do in many places. There is incredible wisdom that we are gathering together. My deep and profound gratitude. Thank you all. Will you join with me in a moment of prayer? Holy One, at the end of a long day, at the point in a season that seems to know no beginning or end, God, we confess that we are weary and some of our shoulders are so heavy laden. But you, God, say your yoke is easy and your burden is light. So come and put your hand on our shoulders. Come and put your hands upon each one of these pastors, each one of these church leaders, each one of these healers. God, I thank you for these shepherds, these community leaders, these doctors and ministers, these who care for your people and strive to live by values of life and life more abundant, of justice, of peace, of flourishing. God, we long for the day when there is healing in the land. God, we long for the day when we gather and hug, not hesitant, but bold. God, we wish to sing bold. We wish to sing the songs of Zion, not in our rooms, but together. Teach us your patience. Teach us your peace. I thank you for the wisdom that has been shared. I thank you for what we are learning in this time. Forgive my frustration, God. We know you are doing a new thing. And though there are times I do not like it, and I am so angry, work something new. You have been with us in every generation. We know you hold the future. We trust that you are a God not of death, but life abundant. So be with each and every pastor here, each and every healer here, each and every steward of your people, of your flock, of your good creation, and bless us, keep us, hold us, equip us with the tools that we need for the ministry that is ahead. Tether us so closely with one another and with you that we cannot help but lead in ways that are good and right and true. God, we love you. Let our ministry be one of healing. Let not one sheep stray from the fold. Bring us ever closer to your love and your community, that when they look upon this time, they might see miracles. God, we thank you for Dr. LaRocque and for all who are about the work of healing. Let that be said of us too. I thank you and I praise you. Let all go and sleep soundly this night. We pray for all of those who have no one to pray for them, the sick, the weary, and the dying. I pray all of this in the name of the one who calls us to be one, Jesus the Christ. Hallelujah and amen. Go in peace, saints. Thank you and bless you. Keep your eyes on the Mass Council of Churches Facebook page and our emails, and with our colleagues in the Black Church Vitality Project and BMA 10 Point. Thank you and thank you. We're really grateful for you being among us.
Thank you all. Have a good night.